How would Vladimir Putin react to Ukraine striking targets inside of Russia with Western-provided munitions? Well, it seems like we're about to find out. Nick Schifrin of PBS recently reported, quote, Western officials tell me there is a U.S.-UK agreement to allow Ukraine to use British Storm Shadows to strike in Russia. Quote, the first announcement of this policy will land when the first missile lands in Russia. Now, I'm going to try to walk a thin line in today's video that I think is important. Escalation does not automatically mean nuclear war. There's a long ways to go before we get to that, but we do have to consider that any escalation between two nuclear-armed powers could eventually get there. Nuance on the internet, I know it's risky. We're going to try for it. I want to start today by looking at some possible use cases of how these weapons might be utilized if permission to strike inside of Russia is granted to Ukraine. Now, there's two major weapon systems largely being discussed here. We have the U.S. ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System, with an unclassified range of 300 kilometers, and the British Storm Shadow, or French Scalp, with an unclassified range for the export variant of 250 kilometers. So with that data, let's go ahead and take a look at some possible targets. We have to assume that Ukraine isn't going to use a limited supply of advanced weapons to strike any sort of unimportant targets. They're going to focus on targets that will have a direct impact on the outcome of the war. Now, troop headquarters is obviously a big one, and there's some key facilities in Crimea and the Rostov-on-Don region that would now be in range for Ukrainian strikes. Airfields are another consideration, but it's worth noting that effects here wouldn't be exactly what they could have been maybe 6 months ago. A while back, Russia began moving their aircraft further and further from Ukrainian borders, and most of the platforms right now being used to strike inside of Ukraine are back outside of the 250 to 300 kilometer range of most Western weapon systems that have so far been provided to Ukraine. Now, there are still, of course, helicopter bases being used close to the border, but we probably shouldn't think about Russian fighters or bombers getting knocked out in the first few waves of strikes here. Of course, air defense assets in Russian territory is another easy one to consider. As those are steadily degraded over time, it does open the possibility for further and more effective strikes deeper inside of Russia. Now, lastly, I feel like we have to mention energy infrastructure inside of Russia. We've already seen Ukraine kind of hammer Russian refineries and storage facilities with drones that's caused quite a bit of damage, and that already has had a direct impact on the war and the Russian economy. This energy infrastructure target could be an interesting area to watch. It's a way for Ukraine to use Western weapons in a way that adds pressure to Putin and the Russian leadership without risking significant civilian casualties, which, of course, is something in this case, in any case, really, that could cost them their ongoing broad international support. So let's go ahead and dive into what Putin might do, and I think for that, it's worth listening to a statement he made on this very topic just a few days ago. Now, subtitles are up on this video, but I'm going to mute it and read what Putin is saying in Russia for anybody who's just listening along. There is an attempt to substitute concepts, because we're not talking about authorizing or banning the Kyiv regime from striking across the entire territory. It's already striking with the help of drones and other means. But when it comes to using high-precision, long-range, Western-made weapons, it's a completely different story. The fact is that I've already mentioned this, and any experts will confirm both in our country and in the West, the Ukrainian army is not able to strike with modern long-range precision weapons of Western manufacture. It cannot do this. It can only do so using intelligence from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. This is data only from EU satellites or from the United States, in general from NATO satellites. This is the first thing. The second, and very important, maybe the key, is that only NATO servicemen can in fact enter flight assignments into these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen can't do this. And so this is not about allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It's about deciding whether NATO countries are directly involved in a military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing other than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States, European countries, in the war in Ukraine. This is their direct participation, and this already, of course, significantly changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. This would mean that NATO countries, the United States, European countries,
are at war with Russia. And if that is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the very essence of this conflict, we will take appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be posed.
All right, kind of moving through that, it feels like Putin's speech cadence and mine isn't exactly lined up. It's a little choppy, but I felt like it was really important if we're going to talk about what Putin might do if these attacks take place. I feel like it's critically important to take a look at his exact words on that subject. Now, many folks quickly jump to the idea of nuclear war, but we're talking about something better represented by a ladder here, essentially an escalation ladder. Now, this is important to consider because neither Russia nor the United States want war with each other, certainly not one that goes nuclear. So both parties are constantly trying to find the line where they can increase pressure without triggering a major jump on that escalation ladder by either side. In fact, Michael Kaufman, a Russia analyst in a recent podcast, talked about possible steps along this escalation ladder that I thought were worth running through. Now, I want to get out of the way early here that Kaufman has recently argued for allowing Ukraine to use Western munitions to strike inside of Russia, and especially with this recent podcast, I think some of his words are being taken out of context to present him as actually advocating against that, which isn't the case. Either way, Kaufman, in a recent podcast that I will link in the description below, said, quote, "From my point of view, their main concerns aren't about nuclear escalation, but horizontal escalation. That is, Russia countering and retaliating by transferring technology, know-how, and specialized personnel to countries like Yemen, like the Houthis, to, say, enable the targeting of major maritime shipping. This wouldn't just be a problem for the United States, but also for basically everyone who relies on that commercial route." And I think that's often overlooked when we talk about this escalation ladder, what Russia's response might be. The immediate for so many people is that if this happens, then Russia is going to strike Germany, England, France, the United States, or even go nuclear. But it's hard to imagine that significant jump up the escalation ladder from what we're seeing play out today. Kaufman continued with some other options here, saying, "Another concern is the expanding Russian sabotage campaign in Europe and the trajectory it could take, which has been very notable over the past year. There could be worries about the future costs and actions Russia might take, whether conventional or mostly asymmetric. I don't mean that if the United States supports attacks in Russia, then Russia is going to start firing attacks into a NATO country, but I use the term to convey that there are other ways that Russia can retaliate." Now, Putin, in his statement that we played just a moment ago, talked about how Ukrainians were not capable of adding the targeting data to the missiles themselves. I'm not sure that's the case, but he did make a valid point there when it comes to the identification of targets. Michael Kaufman also hit on this in his recent podcast appearance, where he said, quote, "The issue of providing certain capabilities also comes down to weapons whose use will have to involve direct Western support. There's intelligence support in their operations. A lot of people do not understand this in the third year of the war. They still do not understand this, that it would mean the United States and other countries in many cases being directly involved in targeting, planning, intelligence analysis, and various other forms of support for strikes into Russia. And maybe for some folks, this isn't a big issue, or maybe it's a very minor threshold to cross, but it's not their call. It's up to the people responsible for making those decisions and dealing with the consequences of those actions to wrestle with them." This is a piece worth stressing because it would be the most overt, direct, clear-cut involvement of the United States and NATO in this war so far. Now, whether you think that is a good thing or long overdue or a bad thing, it would mark a significant change in this war that's worth considering. Now, I do think there's some gray area here between Kaufman and Putin's statements where it's certainly not all targeting data has to be provided by the West for any of these strikes. It's not clear that's been the case for multiple Ukrainian strikes throughout Crimea in the past couple of years. So it's not an all or nothing. Ukraine certainly has targeting capability of their own, but Putin raises a valid point that Kaufman kind of reiterates that some of the more advanced targeting of sensitive sites deep inside of Russian territory, it's not clear that Ukraine has those capabilities right now. So it's likely that they would be leveraging or need to leverage U.S. or NATO intelligence and satellite assets to be able to put those target packets together. Now, something we have to keep in mind here is how anything like this is being framed inside of Russia. So Putin, in his comments earlier in this video, made clear to his domestic audience that any strikes inside of Russia by Western-provided weapons will come with direct U.S. and NATO involvement. So they will see this as a NATO attack. So while I'm sure there will be some very well-informed and thought-out comments in this video about why this is an escalation or why it's clearly Ukraine that's going to be doing all the targeting work, that doesn't necessarily matter. In the case of escalation management, we have to consider how events are perceived by the other side. Now, permitting Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike inside of Russia will directly help Ukraine on the battlefield. whether it's hitting airfields used by Russian attack helicopters, command posts directing the war, or energy infrastructure across the eastern portion of the country. All of these will affect the future of the conflict in some way, shape, or form. But none of these will end the war, and that's where the strategic calculations come in to determine if the risk of escalation is worth it. Now, this is one of those times where I feel like it's worth remembering that the interests of two countries will never align 100%. Personally, I have been in favor of giving Ukraine the green light to strike inside of Russia, but we have to be very mindful of what this could lead to in terms of Russian escalation because there will be some sort of response. Now, what I'll close with is that a decision like this isn't taken lightly, and it's been a serious focus of debate throughout NATO countries for nearly 3 years now, and included in those conversations are people who have dedicated their lives to understanding Putin, the Russian leadership, and their decision-making process. Look, nuclear war is a loss for everybody, and I have to believe that the broad array of analysts and experts weighing in on any decision like this wouldn't suggest an action if there is even a 1% chance of it resulting in a nuclear exchange. So again, when looking at this possible decision about allowing Ukraine to use Western-provided munitions to strike inside of Russia, whether you agree with it or disagree, it's certainly going to change the nature of this war. There definitely will be some short-term impacts, and I think what everybody's waiting for is what are the long-term responses from Vladimir Putin and Russia. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our reader-funded publication. It's called Between the Lines, and it's linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.